Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Jazakallah khair everyone for coming today. Inshallah, today will be a lot more technical than the first lecture. How many of you have watched the first lecture or attended? A good chunk of you? Okay, alhamdulillah. If you have not, then I do recommend you go back because as I've found doing this, teaching the subject over the years, if you do not really have the spiritual foundation of what is zakah, then the technical side becomes like arguing about taxes. And I do think there's a lot of zakah evasion, just like there's a lot of tax evasion for those who come from countries where they have taxes, of course, right? So inshallah today we'll jump quickly for the sake of time. We'll do a lot of Q&A so you can ask your specific questions. Again, just a recap, we spoke a lot about, again, from an Islamic perspective, the grounding is in the fact that this wealth is not our wealth, right? And that's what changes the way we spend it. It is the wealth of Allah Azza wa Jal. It is His right to choose how we dispense it without asking questions. Another example of this, which is outside of zakah, but is the issue of inheritance. Right? People often, Muslim families, one of the biggest conflicts that exist in the ummah is fights amongst families with inheritance. And people say, oh, I want to have this and I want to have it. Allah resolved the issue, so there would be none of these fights. He said, give it in this fashion to your brothers, to your sisters, to your children, to your spouse, to your mom, to your dad, all outlined by Allah Azza wa Jal to remove that animosity that develops when people play favorites or when people select who gets it and who doesn't get it. And we say, sam'an wa ta'an, right? We hear Allah Azza wa Jal's advice, we hear His wahi, and we execute it the way He wills, whether we fully appreciate its wisdom or not. But of course, part of the effort is that we seek throughout our lifetime to learn more and more until we fully appreciate why Allah legislated things the way He did. So today we'll speak about, I'm going to get back to this. The nuts and the bolts of zakah. And we're going to speak today about all the technical aspects from what is it we have to pay zakah on, what is it that's exempt from zakah, what are the two major terms, that's called nisab and hawl, and then who pays zakah, who receives the zakah, and what are the conditions of all the above. So to start off at the broadest level, the most basic principle in Islam about the payment of zakah is wealth that is liable to grow is one which zakah is typically levied upon. I want to make it very clear, it's a really important foundational principle. Money that has the potential to grow is liable to being paid, zakah to be paid upon. So what does that mean? Money that has a possibility of growing. Right? If I have money and I put it into a business, does that money have the possibility of growing? It does. It could also lose, but because it has that possibility of growing, it is something which Allah Azza wa Jalla is going to mandate zakah upon, which is different than certain other things that you have that will not grow. For instance, let's say you buy something for yourself, right? You buy yourself a garment. It's wealth, you own it, but it's not going to grow in its value. You're going to wear it, it's going to get dirty, it's going to get old, you're going to throw it away typically, right? Now, the exception, of course, is if you do buy a collector's item, and you say, I'm buying this jersey of Ronaldo, right? He wore it. Is anyone going to start wearing that jersey every single day? Anybody? No, you wouldn't, right? If you bought a jersey for $1 million, what would you do with it? You'd put it in a frame and you'd hold on to it for many, many years until it was worth $2 billion. This is no longer a piece of clothing, right? This is actually a business asset. So the difference, a lot of what we're going to cover today in zakah is the difference is going to be in the niyyah, in the intention of the person and why they own that asset, what they do with it. So the zakatable assets we're going to speak about today. We'll cover each of these slowly. We'll speak about currency, so gold, silver, cash, any sort of money that's in accounts, cryptocurrency, all this stuff is going to be one type of an asset we'll cover. Agricultural produce, livestock, real estate, business, and then jewelry. All of these have detailed rulings right around zakah. I want to make a general statement to start, which is so much of the fiqh of zakah that was developed in the early centuries was developed in what we would call agrarian societies. Right? This was a world, if we go back 1400 plus years, whether it was in the Muslim Empire or outside of the Muslim Empire, people's wealth was predominantly, about 75% plus, was often in, as a society, was in land that was used for agriculture, land that was used for livestock, and then in bartering and trading, right, merchants. There was no concept of somebody owning a factory, right, 1,500 years ago. There was no concept of someone owning a tech company, right, that is not really takes up space, right? It resides in the cloud. So then the world kind of moved after the agrarian era more into the Industrial Revolution. And that's when we began to have factories and people started to leave the world of being farmers and working on the land to working in factories. And then the business opportunities became quite different. So the zakah rulings obviously were different when there's a different type of an economy. And I would argue that today we're entering a new era. We've been in this era for about the last 50 years, the technological era, the information era, where a lot of the economy is actually run by information rather than actual assets. What do I mean by that? Today you can have like a tech company which actually sells no real products. It simply, for instance, has intellectual property, right? People who sell ideas, and that is worth a lot of money. And classical zakah, right, would not address those issues in a very clear way. So a lot of ijtihad has to be done today, a lot of scholarly reasoning, right, and searching for the evidence. So we'll find today is a lot of differences of opinion on some of the modern ways of paying zakah. So again, if you have questions, you can hold those till the end, and we can try and get through those. So starting at the very, very top, what do you not have to pay zakah on? Let's just start with that. What do you not pay on? Anything that you use in your personal life, that you own for personal use and benefit. So your outfits, your clothes, your shoes, your cars, your homes, all this is not eligible for zakah, even if it's worth a lot of money. So if someone wears super expensive thobes and shirts and abayas, and they're worth thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars, it doesn't matter. The purpose of them is individual use. It is not a business asset. Same thing for somebody's car, right? If somebody has $1 million car or $1 million real car or any other car, the value doesn't matter. If it's for personal use, if it's 1 car, 2 cars, 3 cars, it makes no difference. Someone can have a lot of cars. As long as the intention is personal usage, then they're not eligible for zakah. Same thing applies to homes. Somebody's home that they live in, that they own, or somebody's home they have maybe back in another country they're from, that they visit maybe once in a while. That home, again, is for personal use. One does not pay zakah on that. The third one, that's a little bit, there's a difference of opinion in Islamic law. These first two, there's no difference of opinion. The third one is jewelry that is worn, especially by women. So sisters who wear jewelry that can be even gold or silver in nature. The majority of the scholars do not mandate zakah be levied on that because it is being used as a personal item. The exception, we'll go into detail later, is the Hanafi madhab that says that women still have to pay, or people still have to pay on their worn jewelry. And we can get into that at that time. So there's 2 terms we have to get clear before we speak about all the different asset classes. And people, when you ask like a young child or even like a lay person, like what is zakah, they'll say 2.5% on money you've had for like a year, right? Many people have heard something like that, right? That is grossly inaccurate because it only reflects one asset class. Every single asset class that we're going to cover, so we have all these asset classes, right? Gold, agriculture, livestock, they actually have different nisabs and they have different hawls. So it's not accurate to say that zakah is just 2.5%, right, of money that we have saved, nor is it accurate to say that zakah is paid once a year. It's paid once a year on certain asset classes. So we have to understand what these terms mean. So the word nisab is one of the main words that we have to understand. Nisab has the meaning of something that reaches a threshold, the minimum amount of wealth that is needed on an asset class before you're considered to have enough wealth in that asset to have to pay zakah on it. Now again, zakah is something which the Prophet ﷺ said, it is taken from the rich and given to the poor. So it has to be enough that you're considered wealthy in that asset class. And so like I've said, different assets will have different nisabs, different thresholds. I'll give an example before we go into the details. If you have camels, the nisab is different than if you have sheeps. If you have grains and you have apple orchards, it's different than again if you have cash. All of these have different nisabs. And then the second term that's important is the word hawl. Hawl is the Arabic word for the lunar year. Again, it's important to differentiate. It's not the Gregorian year, not the solar calendar, but the lunar calendar. That refers to the passing of an entire lunar calendar. And that is a consideration for some asset classes, not for all. And as the great scholar Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, the Hanbali scholar, he said the hawl is considered for things that you're looking for growth that takes time to grow. So for instance, if you have money in a business, it takes time for that money to grow. But if you have a cow or 100 cows, it doesn't take time for those cows to grow, right? The cows are cows, right? Time doesn't make them grow more. So let's go through. So before we go, so what we'll do is we'll cover for each asset class, we'll talk about the nisab, talk about the hawl, and then we'll talk about the actual rate of payment. Is it 2.5%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Or some other percentage? So first question we have to answer is, who pays zakah? Does every single person in society pay zakah or not? These are differences of opinion in Islamic law. I will share the most dominant positions and then share the exceptions at times. So the first one is that only Muslims are liable to paying zakah. Non-Muslims in an Islamic society or other society do not pay zakah. And that is because they are not instructed or obligated to follow the details of the Sharia. So non-Muslims would be exempt. And in an Islamic state, they also would not pay zakah, right? They would have to pay some other form of tax. So typically in Islamic history, they would pay what's called the kharaj, right? Or they would pay what's called the jizya. There's different terms depending on the details of it. Kharaj was a term that was used when Muslims entered into non-Muslim lands, conquered them typically peacefully or even by force. They would allow the non-Muslims to keep the land and to work on their land. But since they don't pay zakah, they would pay a tax. And that was the equivalent of a jizya. Or if they don't have land, they might still have to pay a tax that allows them to be defended by the Islamic State. The second condition is that it's not every Muslim who pays, but it's the Muslim who sufficiently owns the nisab. So again, it has to be a Muslim who reaches a threshold of being wealthy. The third condition is that that wealth asset, it has to have met, in certain cases, the necessary time period. We said for money, we'll talk about, for cash, for gold, for silver, that's 1 year, the Islamic lunar year. That's the third condition. The fourth is that the person is not in debt that supersedes the amount of assets he owns. So someone might say, for instance, I have $1 million, right? I have 1 million riyals of assets, but I'm in debt for 5 million. Right? So even though they have 1 million, their debts are extreme. Depending on the type of debt, they may or may not actually have to pay zakah. And the fifth, and this is a debated condition amongst the scholars, is it only for adult males, adult Muslims, males and females? So salah, only adults are obligated, right, once they pass puberty, to pray. Right? We're only obligated, right, for hajj, right, only obligated even for siyam. But when it comes to the issue of zakah, the majority of the scholars, they say that age is actually not a requirement. Right? The Hanafis, again, say that it has to be a child who reaches the age of puberty, but the rest of the scholars say no, because zakah actually is an obligation on the wealth, not necessarily only on the person. Now this is important because I have seen in many cases where people have a lot of money, and they'll say, I have, let's say, 1 million riyals, and I have 4 children. So I say, let's give into each of my kids' accounts 250,000 riyals, and I have no money, right? So I have to pay no zakah. Again, zakah evasion is very real. Very real. I have a real case. Someone came to me years ago when I was the imam, a very well-to-do person. I know them, very well-to-do family. They said, Sheikh, we need, I have to ask you that, please don't share with anybody else, but we're not doing so well financially right now, we need zakah. I said, what happened? SubhanAllah. I thought things were going great. He says, alhamdulillah, they are, but our 2 teenagers are growing up, and we set aside into each child's account like $50,000 for their walima that will happen in like a decade. I said, okay. So he said, yeah, so all of our wealth is gone, right? We put it in the walima fund for child 1, the walima fund for child 2, so our $100,000 is gone, and then the other money we have is not sufficient. I said, that's not how it works, right? Right? And people do the same thing. They say, we put money in our kids' college fund. I had families who told me, private schooling now, again, imagine your kid wants to come here to Education City colleges. So he says, I want my son to be in Georgetown. Well, how much is it per year? 60,000, right? USD, right? Whatever that comes out to in riyals, right? Someone, for one kid, almost $250,000. So imagine you had a couple of kids. You said, no. All my money is earmarked for Georgetown, for VCU, right? For HBKU is a little bit cheaper, alhamdulillah, right? But that's it. My $1 million is locked into my kids' college funds. This is not, even if you did that, the children are liable, you have to pay on their behalf. So again, the majority of scholars obligate it on the wealth that is earned, because the wealth itself needs to be purified, and the wealth is the right of the needy in society. Okay, let's start asset class one by one. Okay, we'll take it very slow, because all the hands will go up or else. Okay, we'll take it slow. The very first asset class we're going to consider is gold, silver, cash, and money that's in accounts. So things that are used as money collectively, right? So there is a nisab, and there is a hawl, and there's a rate. So the nisab for this entire asset class, as the Prophet ﷺ outlined, right, was going to be 20 dinars of gold. Okay, 20 dinars today is equal to 85 grams. And you can do any day you want. Today you can go into the chat, you can type in how much is 85 grams of 24 karat gold, right? And I did it today, this morning, right? And I updated my number because it was different a month ago. It fluctuates, right? And the total is it comes out to being approximately 47,000 riyals. Okay, so the nisab today is 47,000 riyals. If somebody owns 47,000 riyals, they are now considered to be wealthy from an Islamic perspective. Right? Doesn't mean you're loaded and you're super rich, but it means you're out of the category that's needy, right? Because you have 47,000 riyals in your bank account. But that's the first condition. The second condition, you have to have held that for one Islamic lunar year. So again, if you have 47,000 riyals today, and then you had to go and spend 40,000, you're no longer rich, right? Money would have gone down. So that money you have to have from day one. You're going to have it also at day, whatever it comes out to, 350 something, right? Islamic lunar year. Slight difference. The ulama, also there's a different nisab for silver. Most scholars don't use a silver nisab anymore because of the way it's not tied to gold the same way. It's much cheaper. Silver nisab is only about 5,300 riyals. So the majority of scholars, Sheikh al-Qaradawi was famous for really trying to push people to stick to the gold because it was easier to work with. That would be about 47,000 riyals. And I think that makes more sense. If someone owned 5,000 riyals, we wouldn't say they were rich, right? But if somebody owned 47,000 and did not need that 47,000 and it's in the bank account for at least a year, you would say that person is at least at a decent level of wealth. So if somebody owns that much, we said 47,000, they've had it not the exact amount for a year, but day one and the very end of the year, they still have that minimum number, then they have reached the hawl and they would pay 2.5% on it. And we'll talk about how this applies to different types of accounts, because sometimes there's deductions that can be made. So the most basic thing, right now I'm talking about cash, gold, right, silver, or anything else that's stored, right? Again, I'm not talking about jewelry here. I'm talking about gold or silver that's stored for value, whether you have coins or you have bars or anything of the like. Okay. So let's go into the accounts, because most people have a chunk of their money will be in cash, but most people, they invest their money. And that's actually the advice, again, of Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anh, and Islamic law in general. That's why Umar, he said, ittajiru fi amwal al-yatama, la ta'kuluhu az-zakah. He said that invest the wealth of orphans. So, of course, in an Islamic state or in a Muslim society, people take care of orphans. And those orphans have maybe inheritance from their family. But if that inheritance sat around year after year after year, they would have to pay zakah on it. Which again is another evidence that kids would have to pay, because some orphans are kids, right? Who might be under the age of puberty. So Umar is saying, don't let their money sit around and year after year they're going to have to pay zakah on it. Invest that money, right? So it returns something on the investment, and so now their total value is going up, right? Of course they'll pay zakah on it, but it's not going to be reduced by zakah, right? And so most people have money in bank accounts, but then also in some version of savings accounts, retirement accounts. Americans have 401ks. A lot of people have stocks and other types of pensions and different types of accounts. So we'll go through each of those briefly. Stocks. So again, stock is a new concept. Historically, the stock market, by the way, of 200 years ago is not like the stock market of today. Again, distinctions have to be made. If you had a business 100 years ago, you said, okay, I own whatever it might be. I own a number of shops. Now, I own 10 shops, and each shop generates for me a certain amount of money, but I want to have investors. So maybe you open it up and you say, I'm going to split it up into 1,000 shares. And so people put money into the shares, right? This business, the value of the business is tied to how much money it generates every year, right? And the shareholder in this case would get back a percentage of the profits, right? That's how traditional businesses work. If you have a mom and pop store, right? If somebody owns a small business, a coffee shop, right? Their profit is literally what the coffee shop generates, which is very different than today when you talk about a corporation. If somebody has money in a corporation, like a publicly traded corporation, the company can lose money, yet you can make money. Does anyone know how that works? Because the publicly traded stock market of today is actually not about how much money the company makes that day or that year. It's actually about projected earnings for the future. It's about an anticipation or an expectation. So if I bought shares, this is a real example. If you bought shares of Amazon, which now is one of the wealthiest companies in the world, for the first decade or two, it actually made no money, zero. Uber lost tons of money for its first however many years. Tesla lost tons of money. But the stock price keeps going up. Now I'm pointing this out because it presents a dilemma from an Islamic perspective. You would say, wait a minute, you are a shareholder and you're losing money. Technically, right? Your company actually burned through $1 billion of cash. But your share, you bought it at 100, is now worth 500. So have you made money or have you lost money? If you're a shareholder, have you made money or lost money? Okay, so this is going to be the tricky part. Is the shareholder a owner of a business, or does he have a commodity in his hand? This is a distinction that needs to be made clear. Because if it's a commodity, if I'm owning some commodity, like I said, I'm buying water bottles and selling water bottles, the water bottle has a price. This is half a riyal, right? And I have 1 million of these, right? So I have 500,000 riyals. So that's clear. No one would say, well, this bottle of water might be worth 20 riyals tomorrow, so let's give you a different evaluation. It's very, very clear, right? But this is clearly a commodity. No one would say that you are, this commodity is based on the market value of it, right? Whether I buy it and I sell it, whatever the market value is, that's what it's worth. But with the share, it's not like that. It's this mixture, because when you are a shareholder, you kind of do own a portion of the company. That's what it means to be a shareholder. You own a fraction of the company, 1/1,000,000th, 1/1,000,000,000th, whatever number of shares they have. But you actually have no right to make any decisions, right? You couldn't be like walking into the business and say, you know what, I own some of this, I want that thing here, right? Give me this, this machine that's there. No, you have no choice. And the worth of your share, like I said, is not tied to how much money the company made in that year. So the ulama differ. And I'm spending some time on this because there's massive differences. Actually, I would say this issue probably would account for 80% variability in zakat globally. What do I mean by that? So some scholars, what they say, opinion one, the minority opinion globally, but it's a respected opinion with very legitimate scholars both in the East and the West, is that when you own shares, you are a business owner. And a business owner looks at the balance sheet. And the balance sheet tells you that on average, depending on the companies, you have only about 30% of what's on the balance sheet, or 25%, sometimes they say, is actually is capital that's meaningful. The rest is going to be in machines, it's going to be in real estate, it's going to be in whatever, all the different things a business requires to function. So now you had $1 billion company, and you'd say, well, actually, it's not zakatable at $1 billion, it's only zakatable at, say, $250,000 in this case, or sorry, $250 million. That's a huge difference in zakat that's being paid, right? So if you're a shareholder and you own, now we said 100,000 riyals of a share, opinion one says you only pay 2.5% on 25,000, right? Which is very, very small, right? Versus opinion two, which is the majority position that I endorse strongly for numerous reasons, is that you are owning a commodity. It's called a stock market for a reason. You buy and sell shares like they are commodities. Right? They are fungible. You can liquidate them immediately. Whether it's short-term or long-term is not a consideration that the majority of scholars make. The first group differentiates. They say if you're doing day trading, short-term trading, you pay on the full amount. But if you hold for more than 1 year, you can deduct 75%. Right? So again, I'll make it very clear. The preferred position that I hold, and the majority of scholars globally, is that for your stocks that you own, pay on the full amount every single year, okay? Same applies if you have mutual funds. Same applies if you own stock in your company. There's different terms for this. RSUs are called restricted stock units. ESPP are employee stocks, where if you're an employee, they give you a discount and you get access to those shares. So you pay on the full current value, right? I'm going to skip some of these, are very American in nature. Pension is a different case. So pension is another type of a retirement account that an individual will have if you work for certain companies, usually government companies. Are pensions very common here? I'm not as familiar. Even in government companies, they don't do them? Okay. So in a lot of companies around the world, right, they will give pensions for employees. It's a fund where a portion of your paycheck is taken out, and that is invested by the company. And after you retire, you can start drawing from that. And the majority of scholars, they say that you don't pay zakah on anything until you start collecting it. So even though they're deducting every month, a certain amount of your income, you only have to start paying zakah on your pension when you claim it at retirement, right? Last thing we'll quickly mention is crypto. Difference of opinion among scholars whether it is even halal to invest or speculate on crypto. I won't go into that. But regardless, if you hold crypto, it is considered either a currency or it's a commodity, and it is fully zakatable on its current value. Again, so what does this mean? If you bought Bitcoin at $1,000 and now it is worth, I don't know how much. How much is a Bitcoin now? 70 or 80,000, right? You have to pay on the current value. Okay? The current value. Someone might say, but I bought it at 1,000, it's worth 70,000, but I haven't liquidated it yet. Doesn't make a difference. You own that coin that has this value. You are liable to paying zakat on it annually at the full market rate. If it happens to drop next year to 20,000, you pay on 20,000. Doesn't matter what the rate is. Whether you've made or lost, you pay on the total amount as long as you are above the nisab. Excuse me. Can I stop for this for a moment? Any questions on accounts, stocks, or anything related to retirement? Okay, we can come back at the end, but just wanted to make sure no clarifying questions here. Okay, skip this. Too many American issues here, so I'll skip this. Okay, number 2, jewelry. So we said earlier that there's a difference of opinion on jewelry, but let's just go into the details right now. So jewelry here, we're referring generally, right? Jewelry can be gold, silver, platinum, all these things. Right? There's a difference when we talk about the gold and the silver in a jewelry versus just jewelry in general. So let's just go through the details. When is jewelry considered to be zakatable? Right? Number 1 is if it's used in any case, right? Whether it's gold, silver, platinum, makes no difference. If it's business inventory, somebody has a store where they're selling jewelry, or they're selling it online, or they're selling it on any other marketplace, right? It is considered to be fully zakatable if the intention is business. Or if it's stored for financial purposes. So someone said, I want to buy this gold bracelet, right? Because gold is going up. I'm going to buy this gold bracelet, but it's just going to sit in my home or my safe deposit box or some other place for years and years and years until it goes up. Then I'm going to sell the jewelry and make more money on it. The intention here is purely business. It is to make money off of the jewelry. It is not to wear it. It is not as a gift. It is not an ornament, right? It is purely, the intention is to make money. And that's because, again, the principle is being met here. Growth is absolutely possible here. So whether it goes up or not is irrelevant. The fact that it could go up and you're hoping for it to go up meets that condition. And this is kind of a random issue, but people who own gold utensils, gold cups, right, gold kind of ornaments in the house, which the ulama are in agreement is actually haram to own and to use. One cannot use real gold, silverware. It should be called goldware at that point, right? But yeah, you can't use gold forks and spoons and knives. Gold plated, that's not real, that's fine. But pure gold or pure silver utensils or cups are forbidden to use. But if one owned it, they still would have to pay zakat on it. Right? So when do you not pay zakat on jewelry? Again, the majority of scholars say if it is jewelry that is used for personal wearing, even if it's worn infrequently, so wearing it once a year or every now and then whenever there's a wedding, someone pulls it out and just puts it on, then they put it back. The intention, again, that's what matters. It might be going up. And for any of the sisters who are here who've had gold for decades, they know their gold is worth a lot now relative to when they got it. So yes, it's grown in its value, But that growth to you is not meaningful because you have no intention of selling. Your intention is to keep it and to wear it and to pass it down to your children or whatever it may be. So as long as your intention is not financial, there is no zakat due upon it according to 3 of the 4 madhahib. I always say that we want to avoid picking and choosing. So if your whole life you have followed the Hanafi position and you follow Hanafi fiqh, by all means keep paying on it, right? It's a valid opinion. Don't just, for the sake of reducing your zakat liabilities, try to get out of it, right? But what I think is important here is that also to be reasonable. What's tricky is that there's people, for instance, who have gold, especially women, who don't work. So imagine a woman, she has a lot of gold, and that gold is worth maybe hundreds of thousands of riyals, but if she's paying zakah on it every year and she has none of her own wealth, then she would literally have to start selling off pieces of her gold to be able to even pay zakah on her jewelry. So that would not be necessary. But in the case of someone who has excess wealth or their spouse is happy to pay on it, by all means, it's good to pay on it, but it is not necessary according to the majority of fuqaha. Okay, business goes to the next, that's the next category. Sorry, question, yes. Yep. Yeah, good question. So the question is, if you're buying gold for your children, it could be a coin or it could be jewelry in this case or anything like that. Do you have to pay zakah on it? So again, it comes back to the niyyah. If this is a gift that one is buying, and they're saying, I'm buying this gift, for instance, because I'm buying the coin today for my child because the coin's gonna be worth more in the future, then yes, it's zakatable because it is a growth item you're purchasing. It is an investment for your child, just like anything else that you invested for your child. If you put more money in a stock, right? But if the goal is not for growth, but it's for a gift. So let's say somebody has a daughter who's 10 years old today, and they said gold just keeps going up. By the time their wedding comes along, gold is going to have doubled or tripled. Let me buy their wedding jewelry today. But it's their wedding jewelry. It's going to be gift to them, and it's supposed to be something which stays in the family. The intention is not growth in this case, so that would not be liable to zakah. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, business assets. So now we're speaking here, again, not about a corporation, right? It's much easier to speak about this for a small business because I said corporations fall outside of this window because they're actually not being evaluated based on their bookkeeping, right? They're being evaluated based on their projected earnings in the future. So let's stick to small businesses. So if somebody has a small business, right? What I mean by small business is something that's not being publicly traded. It's not something which is liable to, kind of fluctuations based on expectations. It's based on the books. Then what is zakatable? Any merchandise or inventory that business owns is going to be liable for zakah at the market rate. Raw materials for production, if someone has wood or steel or iron or any sort of other raw materials. Any of its accounts receivables, that its money is coming in, any of the cash sitting in its account, all that gets put into its scale of what zakat should be paid upon. And that might add up to some number, right? We said your merchandise, you have a certain amount of value. The raw materials have value. Your accounts receivables have value. The cash, you add all that together and you have your total zakatable assets. But what you don't pay zakat on, and even we'll speak later about what you subtract out, so you don't pay on any fixed assets. What does that mean? If someone bought a business, so you bought a coffee shop needs coffee machines. Coffee shop needs chairs and tables, right? It needs a sign that goes outside. That's expensive to purchase. That machinery, those fixed assets could be worth a large chunk of the business. None of those are liable for zakah. So all that can be essentially deducted or not included. Any rental items that a business is renting out even. So again, maybe a company is renting out some sort of machinery. It's not the value of the machinery that is zakatable because that's not actually where the growth is happening. The growth is happening on the profit. So rental income is added as rental income, not as the value of the machine or the product that's actually being rented. Same thing I said, machinery and furniture, any fixtures. And then, of course, any account payables. So if a business knows that every quarter or every month, right, I have all these account payables, those can be deducted out because that's money that right now looks like it's in your account, but really it's not, it's already being committed elsewhere. And then the last thing that there's no zakah on, which will be deducted ultimately, is what's considered dead debt. Now, every accountant has their own way of calculating this, but typically they say that if money is not paid for a certain amount of terms, let's say that typically you expect within 90 days payment to be made. And you know that after 90 days, if payment has not been made, that the odds of it coming are very, very low to zero, then many scholars say you can deduct that out. And even though it's on your books, right, as things you should be receiving, since you're not going to receive it or the odds of receiving are very low, you can actually just deduct it out completely. So, questions on business assets? Yes?
For rental items, is it the same case as if you have a property, a house that you rent out?
Yes.
So the one that you need to pay Zakah for is only the income from the rental.
Okay.
The one that you need to save and meet the nisab and the house.
Yeah, very good question. So his question is on real estate. We'll get to it in just a minute, okay? So, and the reason why we have to separate all these things is because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ really, people often wonder, like, why are there so many random details, right, about the cows and the sheep and about the agriculture and all these things? Because they give us the principles that allow us to differentiate for these modern transactions. So even though real estate might look similar to a business, it takes its own ruling because real estate is fundamentally a different asset class for many different reasons. We have an example. Real estate is not liquid, as an example, right? So someone couldn't be like, I have a $1 million property. It can't just be flipped. You can't sell it in a minute and take $1 million back, like you could, for instance, for shares, right? Or even if you had certain business aspects, or if you had business merchandise, you could liquidate your merchandise as an example. So we'll talk about real estate. Okay. So this is also a huge difference of opinion because historically, throughout most of human history, real estate was not a real asset class because land was not a problem. At the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Medina was not a place where people are fighting to look for land. And there's narrations, some of them that say that even one companion, he came to the Prophet ﷺ, came from outside and said, Ya Rasulullah, give me some land in Medina. And the narration mentions that the Prophet told him to shoot an arrow. And then he shot his arrow and he says, everything from where here into where it landed is your land, right? Land was like practically free. And if you go to Medina and you look actually at the Masjid Nabawi, the vast majority of the Muslim community lived in that little neighborhood. So living a block away, like anyone who needed to live a few blocks away, right? It was very easy, very cheap. There was almost no concept of rental. Actually, I think it was Imam Malik, rahimullah, who started to first speak about the existence of these things in the region. Because everybody, if you're poor, you just build a tiny house. Right? They said Salman al-Farisi, radhiyallahu anhu, they said that his house, when he died, right, like he couldn't stand in it because the roof was that short, right, and he couldn't fully lie down in it, and he only had like a couple of utensils when he died, and he cried thinking he owned too much. Right? So no one was living in palaces and fighting over real estate and buying and selling homes like it was a big business. Right? Even the poor owned their homes. So now, today, especially in the last few decades, real estate has become perhaps one of the most important asset classes for people to own. Right? It is what differentiates the rich from the poor. And thus, the rulings, like I said, are debated, and I'll explain why. So what is zakatable with real estate? So if somebody's piece of real estate that they're buying is with a business niyyah, I'm buying this because I want to buy the home and then resell the home. I want to buy the apartment, I want to see it appreciate and then sell it when it's more expensive. All that counts as a business, as a niyyah to make money, whether it be a business property or whether it be a residential property. The intention is for the sake of growth. Again, capital appreciation is the goal here. And so, brother, your question, what we have to think about here is why is the person buying that piece of land? Right? It might even answer the sister's question. If someone is buying the land because they're saying, I can't buy a house today, I don't have the money, but I'm going to buy this piece of land because when I save up money over the next decade or 2 or 3, I can build my house on it, as an example, right? This is very common, right? People do this, especially when they're thinking about retiring back in their home countries. I'll buy the piece of land, and then in 20 years, right, I'll build on it, so on and so forth. Now, in that intention, it's not business. You've bought the land, or you bought the building, it's not ready to live in, you're not planning to live there, but the intention is residential purely. So there is no zakah being paid in that case. But once someone's intention is, no, it is a business intention. It is to make money. Now, there's 2 things we have to differentiate between, okay? So again, the intention right now is business. But let's talk about what type of business. So sometimes people buy homes or apartments where they don't expect the property to go up in value. A lot of places around the world, land does not appreciate rapidly. And houses don't appreciate rapidly. Even in, I'm coming from the United States, so I can give extreme examples. If you lived in California, which is one of the most expensive states in the country, property rises incredibly fast. Incredibly fast. I'm talking about sometimes 30, 40% within a couple of years, right? Whereas if you live in the Midwest, land might not appreciate for a decade. So someone bought a house in the middle of the country, someone bought a house on the West Coast or the East Coast. One is going up 25, 30, 40, 50, 60%. One is hardly moved, maybe a few percentage points, right? This is all before COVID, right? Now all that is out the window, right? But the point I'm making here is that that intention matters, because someone who's buying a home because they're saying, I want to generate rental income. That's what I'm trying to generate, is the rent, because I would like to have that rental money coming into my account to allow me to have more money. The niyyah is to make money off the rent. So, brother, your question here, I want to answer it. The niyyah here is rental income. So you pay zakah only on the rental income, not on the value of the home. Okay? So again, you bought $1 million rial home, but you said, look, it's not going to go up in value. It's going to stay $1 million rials for the next decade probably. But every month I'm going to make, whatever it is, 5,000, 10,000 rials of rental income. So you pay on the rental income that comes in. Even from that, some scholars, they differ. Some say you should treat this like agriculture and you should pay actually 10%. Whereas the majority say you pay 2.5% on the rental income that comes in, okay? Now, the second way you think about it is a person saying, I actually don't care about the rental income. I'm buying this home. Yeah, I'll rent it out because I don't want to leave it empty. But the goal is that this house is going up every single year. So I buy it today, and next year it's going to be worth 10% more and 25% after a year. I anticipate large growth. Even though you're renting it, your intention is actually capital appreciation. So you pay on the full value of the home. So if the house is $1 million rials, you would pay on $1 million rials. So again, intention really, really, really matters in zakah, right? And Allah Azza wa Jal, He knows what's in our hearts. So people can fool each other, right? And you can fool, the software you use, but Allah knows what your intention was. So any form of evasion, right, will be tied to one's false niyyah in this case, right? Questions on real estate? Yes? REITs, yeah. So real estate investment trust, essentially, right? This is where you don't own the house itself, but you're taking money and you're putting it into an account that, or a company that is buying a whole lot of houses and apartments and renting them out. The same ruling applies here. Is the fund concerned with simply generating rental income? Which is often the case, because in some of these funds, they're selling the houses off to people, and then the people are going to buy those houses over time, and you're just getting rent every single month, right? Then one might consider that you only pay on the rental income, because that's all that that's growing in your case, right? Whereas some of these investment trusts or the real estate funds, they're saying, no, we're going to buy this home, rent it out for a couple of years, but really the goal is the house is going to double or triple in the next 4 or 5 years, and then we'll sell it off and everyone gets their profit. Here, there's two opinions of what one can do. So the first is that you pay zakah on your rental income while it's a rental property, and then as soon as it gets sold, now that it gets considered a total business asset, and you pay on the full value of it. Another scholars would say, no, you should pay on the full value every single year because that was your intention from day one. So difference of opinion. One can do what... I think sometimes people have to think about the market they're in. Sometimes it's the market's, the rent to price is so extreme that if you paid zakat on the full value, it would have it wouldn't make sense to invest in it in the first place. So I'll give you an example. If someone bought a $1 million home, but the rent on it was only $2,000 a month, right, as an example, right? So the whole year you made $24,000 in rental income, but how much is your zakah? $25,000, right? So you'd say, no, that doesn't make any sense, right? So it's worth looking at those details, which I often, my answer to this, you have to ask someone in your locality who understands the local market, because fiqh is heavily localized. People don't appreciate that the differences of opinion between Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullah alayh, Imam Shafi'i, or Imam Malik were heavily based on where they're living. So, as an example, there were some assets that were cash crops, right, in one part of the ummah, that were not cash crops in another part of the ummah. Where it's a cash crop, the ulama said it's liable to zakah. Where it's not a cash crop, someone say it's not liable to zakah, right? Because there's no evidence or no wisdom in levying zakah on something that's not meant to be something that you're trying to generate a lot of revenue off of, even if you have surplus wealth in it, right? So asking people in your locality, I think, helps the most to tease apart some of these particulars. Wallahu a'lam, right? Also, things matter like taxation laws, right? So we go back to, again, if you're in a certain country with heavy property taxes, those are types of costs you would incur that would change, I think, the ruling, because how much money can you make if you have property taxes and zakah and so on and so forth, right? Other questions on real estate? Yes? Yeah, so this is the same thing. So the nisab applies. So for the nisab, all your cash, all your accounts, all your real estate, you lump all that together. If it equals 47,000 riyals at least, you have the nisab. 1 year passes, then you pay 2.5% on either, again, the rental income in your pocket or on the full value, depending on the specifics. A key point I want to make. This is probably the number one mistake people make in zakah. People think that I paid zakah once on an asset and I'm done. Zakah is paid on the exact same money year after year after year after year. Okay? Really important. It's not on the dollar or the riyal you've made this year, I only pay zakah on. So if you paid 1 million riyals in your account and you paid zakah on it this year, and then next year it's 1.1 million riyal, you pay on 1.1 million. You paid last year on it, you pay on it exactly again. Same applies to real estate, right, or anything else. Many people say, but I paid zakah on it last year. It's okay, it's fine. You have to still have to pay on it, right? So, okay. Livestocks. This probably doesn't apply to most people, so I won't spend too much time. Does anybody own livestock? No? But I will quickly cover it just because, again, I want people to understand that there is a hikmah. And we learn, actually, a lot of the principles of zakah through things like looking at livestock. Now, again, why was the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ so specific? And why in the hadith of Bakr, it's narrated in Bukhari by Anas, about when he went to Bahrain as a tax collector, that Abu Bakr gave him, it's a very long hadith, on each animal, how much to pay. And the reason is because this was a predominant asset class of society. So for that reason, the Prophet is giving you a tremendous amount of detail and also showing that it's not as simple as 2.5%. So let's separate this for that sake. So the first is that the Prophet said in a hadith, when you pay on livestock, he mentioned there in the hadith, there's 3 different ones. There's cows and buffaloes as an asset class, camels as an asset class, and sheep and goats as an asset class. Those are the 3 that have been mentioned specifically in the hadith. So many scholars say those are the only 3 that you pay zakah on based on this type of a logic. I'll explain what I mean by that. So if you have horses, you don't have to follow any of these type of tables, right? You treat all other animals as only if they're business assets. So let's go slowly. So if somebody owned free grazing animals, that is a condition that the Prophet put on it. Right? He said, إِنَّمَا الزَّكَاةُ فِي الْغَنَمِ السَّائِمَةِ, right? That you only have to pay zakah on free grazing livestock, which means that one is not spending their money to feed them every single day, right? You have land and they're eating on the land, and that land is fulfilling, right, their nourishment. In that case, you have to pay zakah. How much? For the cow and buffalo, you have to have at least 30. So the nisab here is 30. It's not actually tied to a dollar amount. It's not tied to anything else, to the number of cows or buffaloes you have. How many do you pay? Well, if you have between 30 and 39, you pay one 1-year-old, right? Like a baby calf, right? If you have 40 to 59, you pay 1 2-year-old female, right? If you have 60 to 70 almost, you pay on 2 1-year-olds. Now, why is all this being done, right? Because the way that animals work is very different. For instance, a male and a female are worth different amounts, right? The female produces milk, right? The female produces children, right? It has a bigger value, right, than the male. And they're also not being done based on 2.5%. So I just want to show you this case. The nisab is not the 85 grams of gold, right? The hawl is not being, this typically happens once a year, right? Because you only pay them once a year. But the rate differs. For camels, the nisab is 5, right? For sheep, the nisab is 40. And then for every other animal, horses, donkeys, you don't pay based on the number of animals you have. You pay only if they're business assets. So somebody has a horse farm where they're actually breeding horses and then selling these horses for business. Now they're treated as a business asset, and we can treat it like 2.5%, like you would for any other asset, right? Same for donkeys, so on and so forth. But if somebody has a lot of horses as pets, right, or they love them and they have them for the shows that they do, then there's no zakah if it's not being used for a business reason, right? All right. Agriculture. Anyone have farmland? Okay, so agriculture is another example of where you have a different nisab and you have absolutely no hawl actually in agriculture. Because you wouldn't want to have an apple and hold it for a year before you paid zakah on it, right? That wouldn't be very good. So, and again, the wisdom is what? The apple is the growth. You don't need time to realize the growth. So the nisab, as the Prophet said in the hadith, right? He didn't say 650 kilograms, right? We use the word, the Arabic words for it that come out to 650 kilograms of a grain or of a fruit. There's no hawl, time period. You actually pay on the day of the harvest. And the rate is either 5% or it's 10%. That's what Allah says in the Quran. It is He who caused gardens to grow, trellised and non-trellised, and palm trees and crops with different kinds of food. Olives and pomegranates, similar and varying. Eat from its fruits when it yields, and give its due, its zakah, on the day of its harvest. And do not be excessive. Indeed, He does not love those who commit excess, right? So Allah says what? He says, وَآتَوْ حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. Give its right the day of its harvest. So what this means is that if somebody owns farmland, they take the grains that they own, and you put all grain classes together, like wheat, barley, oats are all one, right? All these things count as one thing. And if they weigh 650 kilograms worth, then you pay either 5 or 10%. What's the difference? 5% if you've had to spend on the growth of them, so you're watering them regularly. If it's naturally being irrigated, then you pay 10%. So again, the rate varies here. Now, the reason I'm sharing this again, even though most of you don't have this, is to appreciate those differences of opinion. Why do some scholars say on real estate, you should pay 5% or 10%? Because their logic is saying that this seems more akin, real estate, to agriculture. Why? You buy a piece of farmland. You don't pay on the cost of the land. You pay on what grows. And the rate is either 5 or 10%. Real estate, when you buy a home and you rent it out, right? You don't pay on the land, according to most of the opinions. You pay on what grows, which is the rental income. So then you might apply, right, that opinion of the 5 or the 10%. So again, it's learning the abwab of zakah that don't apply to you still gives you some insight into how the ulama take these principles and they apply them into different circumstances that are contemporary. This is how you do, fiqh of nawazil. Okay. Questions on what you pay on? Because now we're going to go into who receives and the categories and some of those details. Yeah. As the Prophet said, he said in the hadith, he said that it's 10% on that which is irrigated by the irrigated by the sky, and 5% which you have to irrigate yourself. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to ask, if you have a physical gold and gold investment in the bank, how do you count the zakah?
Same way.
You add up the two?
Yes. It's an asset class. Cash, gold, silver, bank accounts, everything is one asset class, right? Real estate, anything that's like that. Agriculture is its own asset class. Livestock is its own asset class.
The question?
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustad. I've got a question on stocks, that's all right. How do we assess the correct way of paying zakah on stocks, the value of which is usually subjective to debt leverage of the company? I'm talking about large companies here.
Yep.
And also subject to IPO, for example, which
Yeah.
would be susceptible to market manipulation.
Yeah.
So at the time of those events, I may have the stock, which would then boost the value of my stock, and then I have to pay zakat on that. But then let's say 6 months to 9 months later, it's realized that the company isn't able to honor their agreement on their debt leverage, and then that pushes the value down.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that justify for the smaller shareholders to pay a correct amount of zakat? Because when we talk about shareholders, I think we tend to forget the institutional shareholders in large companies that have influential power to drive the prices up and down.
Yes.
But it affects the smaller shareholders who have to pay zakat on the valuation of those stocks. So what would be the correct way to assess the zakat?
Yeah. Jazakumullah khair. So this question has to do with the individual shareholder, right, and how they are subject to the market forces that are often internal manipulation. People cook their books all the time because they have to show that they've made money to match the earnings, so they have to kind of shift money, or they want to show they have lost money because they have to offset taxes, whatever it might be. They're manipulating the stock price. From the Sharia perspective, That's a risk that a shareholder is taking that they're going to bear the burden of. So all you care about as the shareholder is what is your hawl, that the day you are liable to pay zakah on. So I'll give you some examples, but let's, at the end of it, let's say your zakah was due, the 15th of Dhul Hijjah every single year, right? That's your date of zakah payment, right? Then whatever you own in assets on the 15th of Dhul Hijjah is what you pay on. If it drops in half on the 16th or it doubles on the 16th, it doesn't affect your zakah because you're paying from hawl to hawl. And so all that manipulation, it over time should equal out, of course, unless it's a Muslim company who's manipulating prices, right, at certain times of the year where they think that people are paying zakah on. That's typically not the case, right? But you only care about your strike date. So your hawl is what matters to you. Nothing else matters. But you've opened up another question, which is the general permissibility of stock market, which I think should have its own conversation because there's a lot of unethical things that happen that I think Muslims have to be cautious of what they invest in. And does that meet the criteria? So you mentioned debt leveraging, right? The common opinion that exists by the majority of jurists in the world is based on the hadith of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas when he was talking to the Prophet ﷺ about giving money. And he said, can I give half, right? And the Prophet said, it's too much, right? And he went back. And finally he said, a thuluth wa thuluth kathir, right? A third, and a third is a lot. So the scholars, some of them took from this, that's saying, okay, a third is the excessive threshold of where we want to just kind of have people not invest in. So if a business has more than a third of its assets in debt, then it's no longer halal to invest in. I personally find this to be odd because the hadith is speaking about donating money. The Prophet is saying a third is a lot. And now we're applying it to investing in like haram businesses, right? So again, there's an individual appetite for, I think what one is comfortable with, the type of risk. I think it's best to invest in companies that don't leverage debt as much as you can. And look, it's a ribawi-based economy, right? And the Prophet said a time will come where everyone's wealth is touched by riba, right? We're living in that time. It doesn't mean that it's okay. It's just saying it's so prevalent. So do your best to get out of those assets as much as you can, even if the return on investment is lower somewhere else, because we believe in barakah, right? And we believe that Allah will bless our wealth and our families beyond simply what we see on the books, right? So I think Western Muslims in particular, I would say even Eastern, a lot of the Islamic finance instruments are just Islamic legal loopholes, right? You can call it, an Islamic bond, and all of a sudden it sounds like an Islamic bond, but it's not, right? This is a long topic, I think far beyond this, but that's why speaking to someone you trust, having someone who can satisfy your soul is probably the best before you make an investment, right? Wallahu a'lam. Okay, I want to be mindful of Q&A, so I want to go about 15 minutes, and then we have Q&A time, inshallah. So who is eligible to receive zakah? It's another huge problem. So one problem we have is, what do I pay on? And all the intricacies around it. The second issue that we have to face is who pays? Because zakah in today's world has become just completely a free-for-all in many cases, right? Alhamdulillah, like in a Muslim country, the government regulates salah. Everyone knows what time you pray, right? There's rules, like we don't have to cite the moon ourselves, or the government tells you when is the Eid, when is the Hajj. All these things are determined for us. Zakat, though, globally is not regulated. Whereas at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and all throughout Islamic history, the government would regulate and have tax collectors who would go out and collect zakat from the people. Predominantly go to the farms and look at the animals, count the animals, take the animals, go and get the crops at the days of harvest, right? And all that is being done. And then only a small portion of it, typically somebody's cash or something that's stored, they would individually pay on. But now everybody is individually responsible for calculating and then distributing. So it presents a lot of problems because you have to be highly informed, right, to do what's right. Whereas the guy said you don't do that for other things. Like you don't have to think about the intricacies of salah. Just show up and you say, khalas, it's salah time, I pray. Right? It's hajj time, I go do hajj. So the Prophet ﷺ and the Sunnah really elaborated on these things. And the Quran gives us the 8 categories. Let's talk about each of them briefly and briefly speak about the violations in these categories. Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا صَدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ وَالْغَارِمِينَ وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. So 8 categories have been mentioned. فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. Zakah is only to be used for the fuqara, the poor, right? The masakeen, right? The needy. وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا, for those employees, like the workers who have been entrusted to collect it. For those whose hearts are meant to be reconciled, I'll speak about that in a minute, what that means. For freeing captives or slaves, for those in debt, in the cause of Allah and for the stranded traveler. All this is an obligation imposed by Allah, and Allah is all-knowing and all-wise. I mentioned in the first lecture, this verse was a cause of war, because in Hurub al-Ridda, right, in the wars of apostasy, when Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, and many of the Arab tribes left Islam and they apostated, and many of them said, we're not going to give zakat. Why? Because the Quran, right, is saying that, they would say that in the Quran, Allah says that, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ. They would say that the Prophet ﷺ is the one who prays upon us, right? He's the one who makes dua. His salah upon us is a source of peace. We're not going to give zakat to Abu Bakr. We're not going to give it to the Islamic State. So that's when Abu Bakr waged war and brought them back into Islam, because they took these ayat from Surah At-Tawbah and they misapplied them to being only about the Prophet ﷺ. So what we learn from this ayah, and if you speak Arabic, it helps, because a lot of the problems come from a lack of linguistic understanding. Some of you just took the Arabic classes, so we can grill you on your grammar, right? What does the word innama refer to in the Arabic language? Anyone know? In Arabic, you can answer in English. If I said as-sadaqatu lil-fuqara wal-masakin versus I said innama sadaqatu lil-fuqara wal-masakin, what's the difference?
Like emphasis.
Okay, emphasis. Okay, it's tawqeed partially. Okay, but there's more to it than just tawqeed. Jazakallah khair. So there is tawqeed. What else? It's only for. Yes? You can explain in Arabic if someone knows. Right? Yufid, right? Al-hasr, right? Or al-qasr, as they say. So this innama is an Arabic term that allows you to block off everything else. That's why when the Prophet said other hadith about this as well, he said, innama zakatu fil ghanam as-sa'ima. He says that zakah is only for free grazing sheep, as one example, right? So the ulama took from this, that means that non-free grazing sheep, you don't pay zakah on. Right? Mafhum al-mukhalafa, as we say in usul fiqh. So this innama gives you the ability to say, this is it. Because otherwise it could say that, zakah is for the poor and the needy. But I'm not saying it's only for them. It could also be for these other groups and keep going, right? But once I say innama, it limits it. And it restricts the usage of the category to these 8. So now we got to understand what these 8 categories are. Let's go briefly through each one. I don't know what's going on with our thing today, but it's okay. The first one is the faqir and the masakin. So the asl of zakah, the origin of zakah, is that it goes to the poor. As Ibn Qudamah, he himself mentions, he goes, zakah goes to 2 people. The one who needs it, or the one that the Muslims need. Okay, let's talk about each of those. It either goes to the one who's in need or the one that the Muslims need. So the poor and the needy, of course, are the primary recipients, because the Prophet ﷺ said that explicitly when he said to Mu'adh ibn Jabal, he says, take from their wealthy, give it back to their poor. Right? The essence of zakah is to transfer wealth from the rich to the poor. It's okay, we'll manage. Yeah, it's fine. So the primary category are those who are in either extreme poverty or in general need. And the Quran is particular, right? It talks about the faqir and the miskin. They say the faqir is the one who has very, very, almost nothing, right? Versus the miskin, he might have a home that he lives in, but he doesn't have enough for his food, or he doesn't have enough for things that he needs in life, right? Their family might need. The third category, which is, here it's not that big of an issue, but in the rest of the world, this is actually quite a big issue. What happens outside of a Muslim society? What about Muslims who live in Australia and in Europe and in North America or other places? Who collects zakah and distributes zakah, right? Here at least you can give it to the Qatar charities, they'll take your zakah money and they'll give it out, right? Over there, it's organizations, individuals, whereas Islamic history was not done by individuals, it was done by the state. The state would say, I'm hiring you full-time to go and collect zakah. You get a salary from the zakah collections for being a zakah collector, right? Now what happens today that's often tricky is that people start nonprofits and then they will collect zakah, but then they'll take their salaries from that as well. Right? That's quite a tricky phenomenon that didn't exist previously in Islamic history and generally is frowned upon because 2 things. One is that the individual should be able to find needy people, right? That's part of being a Muslim is knowing your community. And I appreciate the Hanbali opinion on zakat al-fitr, which is to give the actual item to the poor. Right? In Hanbali law, you cannot give money to the poor on zakat al-fitr. You actually have to give the rice or the dates, right, or the other items to those people. Why? right? There is something about interacting with the poor that affects the heart of a believer, right? It's very different. So when you are, in the case of the individual who's just giving their money to some organization, and that organization has a high overhead, a lot of your zakat is being eaten up. So the recommendation typically for al-amilin alayha historically has been, it is state-sponsored. So it generally shouldn't be done by individuals. It would be egregious if someone said, I know a lot of poor people, so give me your zakah, but then I'm going to take 10% for my own kind of well-being, right? I need it for paying rent. It's, I don't want to give you my zakah, I want to give it to the poor. So try and find entities that 100% goes to those who are in need, right? The fourth category is also heavily debated in Islamic law. I won't go into too many details. Well, we call it mu'allafati qulubuhum. Those whose hearts are meant to be won over or softened. So in early Islamic history, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he was dealing with a very hostile environment, he had tribes around him that were looking to attack him and the Muslims. And the Muslim state wasn't very strong just yet. That it's narrated that he would give money to certain tribal leaders. In fact, they say Abu Sufyan, right, and even Muawiyah, radiyallahu anhuma, were given from the zakah money when they were rich rulers of Quraysh to soften their hearts. And it did soften their hearts in many cases, right? So in this case, the ruler of the Islamic State could give money to either enemies or neutral people or an entity he thought that giving them zakah money would collectively help the Muslim state. So give a very explicit example, right? Someone, the Khalifa thinks, if I give money to this person, he's going to leave the Muslims alone. He's not going to wage war against the Muslims. So here you go, $1 million of zakah saves me from a potential $1 billion battle and a loss of life. Is that a good return on investment for the Ummah? It is, right? So this happened very, very early in Islamic history. Then Umar ibn Khattab, he came along and he said that I'm not going to pay mu'allafati qulub anymore because Islam is strong now, right? We now are conquering people. No one's going to come and conquer us. So I have no need to give zakah to people to fight off their evil. So many of the madahib, right, some of them were like, no, we don't do this anymore. Whereas the other madahib said, no, we should still do it, but only when the ummah's in that state. So if the ummah's in a state of weakness, and the Khalifa or the ruler needs to pay to repel harm, then they could use it, right? I won't go into, there's some modern stuff here. And again, Western settings, if someone is from the US, they know of recently there was a fatwa that they could use the zakah money to lobby politicians. I won't go into it. I don't agree with it, although may Allah reward the ijtihad of the ulama. But again, this is a case of, there's conditions for applying any of these things, and sometimes those conditions are not being met, right? Wallahu a'lam. Freeing slaves and captives. Again, very early, right, in Islamic history, the zakah was not, the term was used over and over, but it wasn't legally being used. So all of the Meccan phase, the word zakah is used in the Quran, but there was no strict rules. Finally, when it comes down, and then slaves are included in it, right? So then buying slaves and freeing them, right, is something which was earlier encouraged. Now it falls under actually what zakah is allowed to do. So it could be slaves, prisoners of war, political prisoners again, that can be used to free those people. Those in debt. So this refers to anybody, again, who takes on a reasonable debt, right? A business they tried to start, something happened, they've lost it, right? They're now insolvent. You can give them zakah money to take them out of that debt. The last one's pretty straightforward. I'll come back to fi sabilillah. The stranded traveler. This is a case of someone who may actually have wealth, but they can't access it. And this has happened to many people, where someone is sufficiently wealthy, they went somewhere, a business trip, a vacation, and they lost their wallet, as an example, right? Their passport is stolen, their wallet is stolen, their credit card is stolen. They have no cash they can actually use in this moment in time. That person, if he said, you know what, I need some money, he could actually, or she could take zakah money because they're a stranded traveler who needs that money. Of course, it's easier today. You can, Western Union, you can find some way. But imagine historically that you have no way to get back home. So you would take zakah to get back. The seventh category that I'll come to briefly is fi sabilillah, and that is the most argued category today. It is the one that has led to the opening up of zakah tremendously, because the word fi sabilillah, again, if you know Arabic, has a very general meaning, right? You do things fi sabilillah. If I said, I did something fi sabilillah, do you know what I'm doing? No, I could have fed a poor person, right? I could have donated some money, right? I could have, whatever. I could have smiled and given some sort of other nice deed. Any good deed is fi sabilillah, right? But in the Quran and in early Islamic terminology, fi sabilillah was almost exclusively used to refer to jihad fi sabilillah. So the Quran, when it uses fi sabilillah, it's almost always using it to refer to fighting for the sake of Allah, physical jihad. So the scholars mentioned that fi sabilillah, when you give zakah, it could be used for soldiers who need to buy equipment. They have to buy horses, they have to buy weapons, they have to buy things that allow them to actually go and do jihad. So that's how it was used historically. Two exceptions. The two exceptions that have come out were some of the scholars, they mentioned Hajj as an exception because they said it's literally a path to Allah. And some responded saying that it seems like a weak opinion because Hajj is only due on the one who has the wealth. So if someone doesn't have the wealth, it's not due upon them in the first place. So there's no need to give zakat because that person doesn't need it and the ummah doesn't need it either, right? Either you give money to the person who's in need, right? Or the ummah needs zakat to be invested in that asset, right? And then the last one is the Hanafi school and some of the Malikis would allow students of knowledge, right? Like students of Islamic knowledge who by foregoing, let's say, a career to go and study knowledge for many, many years, right? You'd be in a state of poverty. So some of the ulama would permit giving it to them. So these are the 8, right, that are agreed upon, can be used. So again, fi sabilillah, I highly, highly recommend people not to take it in the modern sense because the modern sense now, some argue that you can use it for anything and everything, which nullifies Allah's wisdom in saying, إِنَّمَا صَدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ. Right? Allah, if He wanted to, could have said that إِنَّمَا صَدَقَاتُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, right? And said, okay, well, everything good, anything good you want to do is fi sabilillah. So that's why these 8 have been spoken about in detail in the books of fiqh, and we restrict it to these. Last few things for time. Priority and preferences. There is agreement across all the madhahib that zakah is generally supposed to be given locally. To the extent that some say it's not valid to be given outside of one's locality unless there's exceptional need. And what this means is that some ulama mention it should be in your city, in your neighborhood. Some say it's a distance that constitutes traveling, so about whatever it comes out to, I don't know what it is kilometers, but we say about 50 miles or so. So just imagine an hour of driving or something, right? But the exception is, of course, if there's extreme need, like right now, if there's a genocide and there's people who are in certain places, like in Sudan, right, in Palestine, places where there is exceptional poverty and an inability to get money to generate it there locally, then we can, of course, give our zakah there. The second priority is to give it to family that truly needs it. And this means to one's brothers or one's sisters, to one's cousins, to one's aunts, one's uncles. All of them are zakah eligible if they're poor. And they are awla, right? They're foremost, we give to them over, again, random poor people we don't know, because you're doing 2 things here. You're fulfilling the kinship and, of course, the zakah. The exception is you cannot give to people who you have directly come from or have come from you. So you cannot give it to your parents or your grandparents, and you cannot give it to your children, right, or your grandchildren. Only people who are parallel to you, right, or diagonal. Let's skip this real fast. Okay, a few other considerations. This is an important one. Many people, they are honorable, even though they're poor, and they don't want to ever ask. And the Quran even talks about this, that there's those people that you would think, that they present themselves, right, as not being in need, but they're in the deepest of needs, right? So you don't have to, if you know somebody is poor, and that knowledge does not have to be 100% guarantee, you're highly probable in your heart that they're poor, then you can give them zakah even without telling them it's zakah. Because if you told them this is zakah, they would reject it. So you could just give them money, right, as a gift or some other way that maintains their dignity and their honor, and you have an intention of zakah, and they don't have to know that it's zakah, that's fine. It can also be given incrementally if necessary. There's cases of where if you gave zakah to somebody all at once, that they might waste that zakah, right? They're not good at, let's say, planning, or they need it, let's say, for rent for some time, or they need it for bills. So you could say, I'll allocate the zakah on a monthly basis so that you can use it on the things that you need. The third condition is also a very important one that's violated often today, which is the recipient must have full ownership and control over the zakah. And what that means is that it can't be, and this does happen often, is that people will say that a good example is a school. right? A school will say, well, I want students to take, I want their tuition to be paid from zakah. So they can come and they can sign up for zakah, but the only way they can have that is if it goes to tuition, right? So you're no longer giving that person control of their money, right? They don't own it. So if without the ownership in the individual, it doesn't count. The same reason why you can't use zakat to build buildings, right? For masajid or for orphanages or any other need, because the asset is not owned by an individual, right? Sadaqah, general sadaqah is used to build the facilities, the waqf, endowments, and then zakah is used on the individual themselves, right? For their food, right? Or something which they're going to have in their hand, right? And the last thing is not to give zakah to those who are able-bodied people who can earn, but who choose not to. And this is actually far more common than you think. This often happens in the case of people who lost their job, but they had a high-paying job. And they will not settle for another job unless it's paying a lot. So literally, this is common, where you have people who are making, let's say, salary is 40,000 riyals per month, 50,000 riyals per month, and they got laid off. Now they get offered a job for 20,000 riyals a month. Like, no, I'm not going to take it, right? And they're going to come collect zakah rather than take a pay cut, right? No, you don't give money to people who refuse. They have the ability to work, but they're looking for a certain type of employment, right? All right, all right, 3 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A. I want to close by showing you the possibilities. And again, these are very, very, very rough projections, but it opens up your mind, because we started our session in Ramadan by speaking about the ability of zakah, the possibility of zakah to solve a lot of the poverty in the world. Again, not in and of itself, you need proper Islamic economics, but it can make a massive dent in the poverty of any society if it is applied properly. So I did a little bit of very simple homework. I said, okay, what's the population in Qatar, right? Somewhere around 3 million people is the number I found as of last year. And the majority of them are in this working age, 25 to 64. And a little bit of digging around, you'll find that about 1 million of the people who are here, you would classify them as poor laborers, at least, right? If not more. But let's just make math easy for today. So a third of the population, again, even if we use our numbers here, right, are day laborers who are poor, right? None of them are going to be paying zakah. About 1 million of them are also going to be children / non-working spouses. They're not going to be paying zakah. So you have about 1 million people in this country, approximately, who you would say are in some sort of white-collar jobs, either locals or nationals or expats, who are possibly eligible for zakah, right? Possibly. So let's do a little bit of math. I said, in my math, I assumed that only 30% of those people were actually rich enough to pay zakah out of the 1 million people, right? So about 300,000 of them, right? So let's do some very, very easy math. And you guys tell me if you think this is too generous or not, right? Imagine out of the 1 million people, 200,000 of them had about 100,000 riyals that was zakatable. Is that a reasonable number to say? I mean, it's like less than $30,000, right? Reasonable? Yeah. I think so, right? So each person pays how much zakah every year? 2,500 riyals, right? So out of those 200,000 people, they're paying, right, 500 million riyals, right? We go to 50,000 people, right, who are paying, who have a total zakah net worth of 500,000 riyals. Reasonable? So each person pays their 12,500, right? And we get about 625 million riyals right here, right? Go through 25,000 people who have just 1 million. And I did, by the way, there are numbers on this. Qatar has one of the highest percentage of millionaires in the world as well. I think there was about 30,000, they said at least minimum, of millionaires. It's probably higher than that. They said 14% of the population might be millionaires here. As dollars. Dollars was the number that was given. And there are billionaires here. Those are public information. So I've pulled the billionaire data as well. So if we just do a little bit of math here, and you can run through each one, I won't waste your time. 300,000 zakah payers who have about $10.5 billion riyals worth of money, who would pay 261 per person. Who cares, the average? But the total would be about 6 billion riyals per year, right? In Qatar, if you had 6 billion riyals to distribute, would you get rid of a lot of the poverty? Right? You would, without a doubt. And this is, I'm positive, I've undercalculated. I'm absolutely positive. Because even the billionaires, I underestimated their worth, right? And that's only publicly known, right? Let alone what is happening behind the scenes, right? That's common in every society, right? The percentage of people who are claimed to be billionaires or millionaires is far lower because people don't like to report these things, right? So just in this small country, right, we can generate 6 billion riyals per year. And think about what a government could do with that, right? To eliminate poverty or at least address a huge chunk of it, right? So even though it probably wouldn't eradicate all of it, maybe it takes out 25% of it, maybe it takes out 50% of it, but you can do a lot with it, right? So I'm gonna have to end there because of time, but the last thing I do want to mention is a couple things on debts because this is important. I mentioned debts as something that you subtract in zakah, but the only debts that you subtract lump sum or short-term debts. So when you're gonna calculate your zakah, if you have a debt due within your year, right, the upcoming hawl, then that is something you can subtract. If it's more than a year, like a mortgage or a car payment, you can't say, I bought a car, I owe 100,000 riyals, I'm gonna subtract 100,000 riyals, right? Or else no one is ever gonna pay zakah because most people make payments on things they own. In this case, some of the scholars, they permit just subtracting an upcoming installment, which even I would argue that's probably not ideal, but if one wants to, they could. I'm gonna quickly skip and just give you a couple examples as we end, just to walk us through some math, so when you go home. I kind of would be nice to have my dates here, but that's fine. Assume the date should be, let's just say the 2nd of Ramadan of this year. Somebody had 120,000 riyals of assets. They reached the nisab, right? What was the nisab again? Who remembers? About 47,000, right? So somebody got a gift, an inheritance, 120,000 riyals. Now, they've reached the nisab, step one. But they have not had the passage of the hawl, right? So they're gonna wait. Let's say 6 months into the year, the middle, let's say of Muharram, they buy a car for 80,000 riyals. Now how much do they have? 40,000 riyals left. Are they at the nisab? No. But we don't cancel them out and start all over. Right? They had the nisab. So we're gonna wait until the end of the whole year to see if they still have the nisab. So it's just a waiting game at this point. Now, a few more months pass, he gets now to the end of his year. Now that person had 40, he went up to 60. And they had a debt of 10,000 that was short term. So what would they do? They would take the 60,000, subtract the 10,000, and they would pay zakah on 50, and that's still above the nisab. So their zakah payment is very small, 1,250 riyals, right? Second example, somebody had 1,000,000 riyals. Yes, they have the nisab, right? They go and they buy an apartment for 1,000,000, but the down payment is only half a million, so they still have 500,000 left. Their monthly mortgage is 10,000 riyals. So let's say now their zakat is due. They take their 500,000 that they own, subtract possibly the upcoming installment. They still have 490,000. Now they're going to pay 12,250, right, of zakah, right? Last example is somebody now who has 20,000. So they don't have the nisab. So they don't start their calendar yet, right? They have to wait till they get to that point. 6 months passes. They make a deposit of 30,000. Now they get to their 50,000 point. This is now the beginning of their calendar date, right? In this case, it'd be the middle of the year. Now they wait a whole lunar year. If they've gone up to 65,000, okay, looks like they had the nisab, right? They had it for a hawl, but they had a short-term loan of 30,000 riyals to somebody, right? So actually they're 65,000, they're gonna subtract, right, their 30,000, and now they're at 35. So they actually don't have the nisab for a hawl after consideration of debt. They are not gonna pay any zakat this time, right? So when you go home, right, and you're gonna do your spreadsheet, do this every year, take your asset classes, add them all up, take your deductions, take them out, make sure you have the nisab, make sure that the hawl is passed, unless again it's agriculture, and then run all of your deductions, and then you should be good to go. So I will end there because of time and open it up for questions and answers. May Allah Azza wa Jal allow us to be amongst those who are blessed with wealth so we can pay zakah to those who are in need, and may He make that a means of forgiveness for us. As the Prophet said in the hadith, as-sadaqatu burhan, right? That charity is a proof of our faith. So may we fulfill that obligation upon us, and may that be a proof Yawm al-Qiyamah for us all. Questions?
Assalamualaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I have a question.
Yes.
For example, you have purchased a land like 5 years ago or something like that.
Sorry, you purchased what?
I purchased a land.
Uh-huh.
Okay, property. And it's for like, considering like it's like investment for the kids or like for the retirement purpose. Okay? So whether zakat is applicable for that.
Yes.
That land tomorrow I might if it's some difficulties I may sell the land.
Yeah.
I have not decided on that fact. So my motive is quite for the kids for their future or something. Whether zakat is applicable. So if yes, whether how the zakat has to be paid for the appreciation value or like how is it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, good question. Jazakumullah khair. So again, the question is land purchased for children or for oneself for retirement. How do we pay zakat on that? Again, what is the intention? Is the intention I'm buying the land for my son, not so that he's going to buy his home on it, but so that it appreciates, then I'll sell the land, and then I'll give my son the money. Now that intention is a business intention. So if that's the intention, you would pay zakat on the cost of the property. But if the intention is no, land is going up, I want to buy land for my son or my daughter so that when they're older they can build a home on it, now it is going to be a residential property intention. So they don't have to pay zakat on it, nor do you have to pay any zakat on it. Same thing for you. If it's a retirement home that you hope to build in the future, whether you build it or not is irrelevant. That was your intention. And if you sell it because of hardship after 5 years or 10 years, now you put that into your total assets and it'll start to count for your zakah. But as long as you're holding it as a retirement asset to live in, then you would not pay zakah on it. Wallahu a'lam.
Can we give zakah to a relative, needy parents who are relatives who live outside your country of residence? You mentioned that you should give it within the country.
Yes, jazakumullah khair. So the question is, do we give zakat to needy relatives who might live outside of the country, right? So again, this presents that dilemma where the relatives are first and should be given preference, but also local should be given preference. So there's a little bit of a contradiction here, or you got to sift out which takes priority. I would argue that, so the opinions are okay, they would allow either one, but one should really think most about the level of need. So for instance, are those relatives who live far away, do they have other sources where they could get zakah from relatives who are nearby, like another sibling or another relative? Or do you feel like if you don't pay it, then they would be in a hardship? If they would be in a hardship without your payment, I would say paying it to them is completely fine and probably preferable. But if again, it can be done by someone locally, then give it to them, let them do it, and you could do it where you are. Wallahu a'lam, right?
Otto has another question here.
Jazakallah khair. The question of debt, I think, is quite clear when you owe debt, when you have some debt. But what if somebody owes you money?
Yeah.
And you're not sure whether they're going to pay you back? That's one scenario. And you're sure they're going to pay you back in a certain number of years, but then they don't pay you back and you have to delay. What happens in those instances when it's the time to pay?
Yeah, good question. Jazakumullah khair. So the question is now on when you have someone who owes you a debt. Also, the difference of opinion amongst the scholars. I'll share two opinions, and you can pick from either of these because they're both fine. The first is that it's the expectation of the repayment that you take into consideration. So again, are you living your life? Let's say somebody, you lent them 100,000 riyals, and you expect 100,000 riyals back in a year. So you're living your life as if you have those 100,000 riyals, even though you're not using it, right? You're making decisions as if that money is going to be in your pocket very soon. Some scholars say because it's expected to be returned, you should calculate that into your zakah. I prefer the opinion that says, in this case, you only pay what's in hand for two reasons. One, there's no guarantee of repayment. Number two, it's not able to grow. And because it cannot grow and has no possibility of growth, that it should not be liable to zakah. And then if they pay it, now you include it in your zakah for the upcoming year. If they don't pay it, this is very important, you cannot forgive it by zakah. Very important point. People do this sometimes. They say, you know what, someone owed me money and they couldn't pay it. Well, I'm just going to write it off as zakah. No, that was not your intention. Right? That is a loss that one has to take. Right? It is you can't say that I'm going to, just forgive myself of zakah and change my niyyah. Right? So, just my opinion personally is take what's in hand. And same thing if you're going to pay, right? If you've paid somebody a debt, right? Of course, that's something that you subtract out. Even though you plan to pay them back, you don't have that money, subtract it from your assets. Right. Good? Yeah.
When you receive the money after 5 years, do you pay back the last 5 years you haven't received?
Yeah, so again, difference of opinion. Some say you should pay back. I strongly believe you should not. Because again, that money was not liable to growth. and you were not able to use that money in a way that was intending the purpose of the wealth is for. So you just pay for the year that now you have it.
Testing. Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I'm Halima. I'm from Malaysia. So I would like to ask, from my country, we have zakat from our salary zakat. So for my case, I'm working here. So I have to pay zakat in Qatar, salary zakat in Qatar, or I can pay in Malaysia. Thank you.
Okay, so just a clarification, is your salary coming from Malaysia or coming from Qatar?
Coming from Qatar.
From Qatar. Okay, so the first question to clarify is there is generally no zakah due on salary. Okay, that's just the first thing. Maybe there's something I'm not fully appreciating about what the Malaysian government does, but generally, because salary is this money that comes in. From that money, you are buying food, clothes, school expenses. All those things that you spend money on are no longer part of your savings, right? So they're not going to be included in your zakat. So if you made, again, whatever it is, 100,000 ringgits for that year, you don't calculate those ringgits into your zakat as salary, only what's left over that goes into your total. Now, in your case, since you're making money in Qatar, there's two ways you can do it, right? One is to say that, so the first is that the government's not taking zakat from you here in Qatar, so you are liable for your savings. Paying it here or in Malaysia takes the same ruling. Some scholars say the preference is locality, some say the preference is for the need. Do you see more of a need over there? Do you have family that's there that's in need? You can use your judgment. Both are permissible. Wallahu a'lam.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Jazakallah khairan.
Where are we at?
I would like to ask about cryptocurrencies.
Yes.
So many opinions and arguments. Some say it's haram. So could you clarify this?
Maybe HBKU will have to have a program on this. Look, the issue is debated amongst the scholars. I'll give a general answer. I'm not going to give a fatwa on the issue, which is in Islamic law, there's a fundamental principle that's called risk tolerance, essentially, right? Al-gharar, right? What is the level of risk that is permissible that one can engage in? Because there's always risk. If I put money in a business, there's a risk it could go down, right? There's no guarantees allowed. Actually, that's another condition of Islamic law. I cannot put money in something that is a guaranteed investment, right? It has to be liable to going up or to going down. I can't say you bear all the risk and I only gain the profit, right? Which is one of the reasons why riba is haram, right? Because in this case, you're saying, I don't care what happens to you. You might lose money. I want my money back, right? So the issue of cryptocurrency, there's a couple issues. One, does it constitute excessive risk? That's one question we have to answer. And I would say that this issue of crypto is very broad. There are meme coins, right? There are all kinds of stable coins. There's Bitcoin, there's Ethereum. We can't throw them all in one bucket. We have to differentiate between those that might be considered to be more stable and less risky, and those that are incredibly volatile. It's like a meme coin is by design meant to be volatile. And so that would be far more prohibitive to engage in because it is akin to gambling in many ways, right? It's not really any sort of a real calculated investment. There's no real growth for a society. But if someone is saying, look, I'm going to take a stable currency, right, that I think is going to have value, now you present a separate dilemma. Is the cryptocurrency, in your position, a commodity or is it a currency? It's a really important distinction. If it's a currency, we're not supposed to be trading currencies. That's in Islamic law generally, right? Buying and selling currencies to make money is not something we're supposed to do, right? Currency is supposed to be a means of exchange. If it's a commodity, which I think most people treat it as a commodity, most people don't own Bitcoin, they can go shop in Bitcoin, right? Like most of us are here, we're in Qatar, we're not from Qatar, but we own riyals because we need riyals to buy and sell. So no one is in need of buying Bitcoin to go and shop. So Bitcoin becomes more akin to a commodity, which from that perspective, right, it seems to be more halal to buy and sell a commodity because you're buying something which you think is going to go up or down. Some of the ulama give a third condition, which is say a currency in and of itself is something which has to be regulated by some sort of a government or society. So some of the ulama actually say that you cannot use these as currencies because the governments don't treat them as currencies. So again, there's two opinions on it. I don't think the issue is settled. I think it's quite complicated and ever evolving. I'll leave it at that. So maybe those experts in crypto can give better answers. But this is the mulakhas of the mas'ala. Wallahu a'lam. Yeah.